Hello and welcome to Where the Bush is Burning. I'm your host, Tom Tice, and I'm glad that you've decided to spend a few minutes as we have another conversation about Christ. That's what we do here on Where the Bush is Burning, and so I'm very happy that you've taken the time to have a look at what we are doing here. Today we're going to talk about a situation where Christ involved himself and spoke with someone who was outside of his particular ethnic origin. We find this in John chapter 4. In the 4th chapter of John, it says that Christ had to go up north from where he had been down in the south in Israel, and he said that he had to go through Samaria. Now, that may not be particularly significant to us. However, Samaria was ethnically different from Israel in that the Jews and the Samaritans didn't have anything to do with each other. The reason was that the Jews at this time were prejudiced against the Samaritans because back years before, centuries before, when the Assyrians had taken people away, the Babylonians taken people away, that they had not taken all the people out of the land. Well, the people that stayed in the land then intermarried with other peoples, and as a result of that, as far as the Jews were concerned, the Israelites were concerned, the Samaritans were half-bred, and they were not ethnically still considered to be Israelites, and so they had a very strong prejudice against them. There were religious differences as well. The Jews regarded Mount Zion or Jerusalem as being the place where people ought to worship. The Samaritans had developed a different tradition, and they were worshiping in a place called Gerizim, which was another mountain. And so the net result of that was that there was a very strong ethnic division between the Jews, the Israelites, and the Samaritans. So that sets the scene for what Christ says. Christ says, I have to go through Samaria. So his disciples, which realize had not been following him up until this time for very long, followed him as he traversed from the south to the north. And instead of going around Samaria, which is what typically the Israelites tended to do, was to avoid that whole area, he said that he had to, needed to, go through Samaria. So that brings us to the story or the conversation about Christ and what he does in this particular instance with someone who is of a different ethnic background and who was regarded negatively generally by the group out of which Christ came. So he goes to the well, and of course the well near Sychar, and the well in that time was the common meeting place. It was the place where women gathered to draw water. Now, typically they tended to do that in the morning or the evening. Christ landed in this particular location about the 6th hour of the day, so he was there about midday. So as he was there, there came a lone woman out to draw water. Now, this would have been somewhat unusual. Normally, most of the women would have come, as I said, in the morning or in the evening. So it was rather unusual for this woman to come in the middle of the day. So Christ, sitting there beside the well, asks the woman for a drink of water. This is a fairly common practice in the Middle East, and it's considered to be a great act of graciousness or hospitality to give someone a drink of water, because water, of course, is very precious in that part of the world. So the woman responds in an interesting fashion. She said, "Why do you, as a Jew, ask me for a drink of water, because the Jews don't have any dealings with the Samaritans?" Well, Christ responds to her, if you knew who I was, you would be asking of me, and I would be giving to you living water, water springing up, as it were. And so he intrigues her by this conversation. And so then, as they carry on this conversation about living water, he begins to speak to her about spiritual things. And as he speaks to her about spiritual things, then she becomes more and more intrigued. And at a certain point in the conversation, he says to her, "Go call your husband," because she was finding out things about herself and about the truth that she had never known before. And he said, "Go call your husband." Well, she responds, "I don't have a husband." And he reveals something of his own knowledge of her by saying, "Well, that's a true statement, because you have had 5 husbands, and the man with whom you're now currently living is not your husband." Well, she very deftly switches the conversation around and says, "Oh, I perceive that you're a prophet," changing the subject entirely. And she then asks the great question that a Samaritan would ask. She said, "Your fathers say that in Jerusalem we ought to worship, and our fathers say that in Gerizim, or this mountain, is where we should worship. So which is correct?" And so Christ responds by saying, God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth, and that there's going to come a time when neither in Mount Gerizim nor in Jerusalem are people going to worship. So she then responds, "Well, we know that when Messiah comes, or Christ comes, that he will tell us all things." And Christ makes a very interesting revelation. Now, realize that in chapter 1, we find this sort of allusion of his disciples where they say, one of the disciples says, you're the Messiah, you're the King of Israel, you're the Son of God. John refers to him as, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So the disciples had some inkling about him being the Christ. But Christ had, up until this time, never really said in so many words, "I am the Christ." In this particular instance, even though he's talked with other people before, he now centers on this particular subject when she raises the discussion about Christ. When Christ comes, he's going to tell us all things. And he says, "I am he. I am that Christ. I am that Messiah." So it's rather remarkable that to this particular woman, who in her society would have been very despised, in her society would have been shunned. Probably the reason why she was coming in the middle of the day was that she could avoid the other women. She'd had 5 husbands. The man with whom she was living was not her husband. So there was a social opprobrium under which she was living. And so Christ responds to her discussion of who Christ is and says, "I'm Christ. I am the Messiah." Which is rather remarkable when you think about it. This was the person in the Gospel of John that Christ chose to have recorded as being the first person to whom he very boldly and very blatantly said, "I am the Messiah. I am the Christ." So that's quite interesting. Now, the woman was quite excited, and she ran off into the city, and she said to the men, "Come and see a man who told me everything that I ever did. Is not this the Christ?" So it's quite remarkable that she all of a sudden left her water pot, ran into the city, went to the man with whom she was familiar, certainly, and said, "This is the Christ." So then they all, listening to her, came out and began to go out to the well to encounter this remarkable person. The disciples, when they showed up, because they'd gone into the town to find some food, when they showed up, they asked him about eating, and he said, "I have food to eat that you don't know of." And then he pointed to the people coming out from the city and saying, "Look, lift up your eyes, the fields are white unto harvest." These people would have been coming out with their traditional keffiyehs and headdress on, and it looked like waving sheets of grain, or waving fields of grain, I guess I should say. So at any rate, it was quite interesting that this was the woman to whom Christ revealed himself in the book of John first as the Messiah, as the Christ, the promised one. That is quite remarkable, and I think we ought to take some encouragement out of that. We may not consider ourselves to be particularly exceptional people. We may not consider ourselves to be the high, the mighty, the movers and the shakers in the world. We may have, in some of our cases, some pretty disturbing backgrounds. We've been some places and done some things of which we're not proud, and we've perhaps lived a very, very different sort of lifestyle, perhaps than the average person. So it's quite remarkable to us that this person was the person to whom Christ revealed himself. But it gives us hope, because at the end of the day, wherever we've been and whatever we have done, Christ reveals himself to people like us. He reveals himself to people who are like this woman. And so it's very encouraging to many of us, because whoever we are, wherever we've been and whatever we've done, Christ presents himself to us as the only Redeemer. He presents himself to us as the one for whom humanity has been waiting. And in this particular case, as we look at this woman, we have sympathy with her, we have empathy with her, we understand who she was and where she was in the social scheme of things. And it's quite remarkable that Christ, in his compassion and in his wisdom, decided that this was the woman to whom he would reveal himself first, at least as far as the Gospel of John is concerned. So it's quite interesting to us that this is the case, and it gives us a bit of encouragement. It gives us a bit of hope, because if Christ was for her, then we have every reason to believe that Christ is for us. If Christ showed himself to her, we have every reason to believe that Christ can and will and does show himself to us. So that's our conversation about Christ for today. If you've never embraced Christ as your Savior, then certainly I would say this is a person you need to know. This is a person you need to personally encounter, with whom you need to have a close personal relationship. So I would say to you, as this woman would have said, is not this the Christ? Is not this the person for whom we all have been waiting? So I would say, certainly, as you listen to these conversations about Christ, you should consider very carefully that this is a person you, at all costs, need to know. Now, if you've enjoyed this conversation about Christ, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Would be tremendous if you would like it. If you would subscribe also as well. Make sure your notifications are on properly so that you can get whatever we send out from Where the Bush is Burning. And then also, it would be good, if you like, for you to read our devotional. That is at hopeharbor.church. That's all one word, Hope Harbor, and then .church. So we have a devotional also called Where the Bush is Burning, comes out every day. You could go to Substack, and you can get Where the Bush is Burning from Substack. They will send it to your email every day. These are various ways that you can encounter what we are setting forth for the benefit of anyone who desires it. So we want you to come back again in the future. We want you to enjoy what we're doing in our conversations about Christ, and hope that you will be drawn out after him. Once again, hopeharbor.church, or Where the Bush is Burning on Substack, or subscribe to this, our channel, Where the Bush is Burning, and we'd like to hear from you or talk with you again sometime in the future. And do join us. We try to do this once a week, and we would be happy for you to be a part of what's going on. Thanks very much. Have a good week.